Hi, this is Sable Schultz, she, her pronouns, Director of Transgender Programming at the Center on Colfax, here again with David Duffield, Center Historian, to talk more about queer stories in the African diaspora. And what are we starting with? What are we going with today, David?
Sable, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you. I appreciate it. Today, we're going to be talking about the lives of women-loving women in the African diaspora, specifically from the um, the West Coast same-sex colonies and communities through the colonies of Suriname, the Middle Passage, and into the 18th or 19th centuries in the Caribbean and in Africa. So, anthropologist Gloria Wekker notes that the term mati or matisma is from the Sranan-Tongo word for women who have sexual relations with women, but who also have relations with men as well. Wecker notes that in African traditions, what we would today define as close homosexual or homosocial bonds were oftentimes thought as mere friendships, though the word homosocial friendship is often used to describe, in 19th century terms, a white female deep loving friendship. As historian Estelle Friedman notes, it can be extended to many, many different cultures. So traditionally in queer historiography, the term close romantic friendships has been applied to white women of privilege in colleges or all female schools in the American Northeast during the 18th and 19th centuries. However, the term is extended to many different cultures, and one sees commonalities in the cultures as well. The way that women love each other, the way they romance each other, the communities that they form with each other. And as historian Lisa Dugan talks about the acknowledgement of a mutual romanticism and sexuality, which creates the foundations for a historical categorical analysis and definition of women loving women, even if it is a more broad and encompassing term. We would classify women in this historical category as bisexual, queer, lesbian, trans women in some cases. However, these are women who, for their whole lives, typically have female or biologically assigned female partners, even though their gender presentations can be diverse. But it's a much more broad and encompassing terms. For the presentation of our story today, we're going to talk about the lives of women loving women throughout the African diaspora, specifically using the term Matism, because that's used in the historical literature when looking specifically at the Middle Passage and the colonies and the aspects of slavery. For Wecker, the idea is that a deep social bond exists not simply within these women's cultures, but that also West African cultures had were devoid of negative connotations of this category of women loving women of Matism. In fact, it came to be respected. Wecker notes that there were anthropologists in the 1930s, 50s, and 70s who, throughout Western Africa, Price and Price and Herskovitz in 1938, noted that women who were self-identified Matis traced their lineage back through the traditional African cultures for centuries and centuries. Specifically, they noted that in the kingdoms of Dahomey and Ashanti, women could actually marry their respective partners in the late 19th century and enjoyed statewide protection, meaning that their relationships were sanctioned by the political entities that governed West Africa, as you saw with queer and trans women in the last lecture. In a sense, women loving women in Africa shared the status of acceptance that was not found in most other parts of the world. As we continue looking out through the African diaspora, it's important to remember specifically what the Middle Passage looked like. The Middle Passage was horrific. There were anywhere between the 14th and 19th centuries, the beginning and end of the African and Atlantic slave trades, something like 3 to 5 million people who were enslaved, dehumanized, and their bodies taken for the use of plantations in the Western Hemisphere. Wecker speculates that the Dutch word shipmate inspired the creation of the word mati, of those who survived the journey through the African Middle Passage together. While women in this passage, according to Wecker, she notes that they oftentimes called each other sibi, or a person that represented a special relationship between them. The word sibi reflected women who had experienced trauma on board African slave ships and enslavement and had gone through the process of quote unquote seasoning. This is the specific process of preventing people from using their native language, cutting all of their hair off, dehumanizing them, punishing them when they would try to practice their native religion, and was applied to everybody who went through the Middle Passage. Those who survived the Middle Passage and even went through 7 years of seasoning, as it was called in the islands of French Hispaniola or Spanish Cuba, something like only 3 out of 5 of these folks survived. While during the whole of the Middle Passage, it's estimated that hundreds of thousands of people committed suicide or died during the Middle Passage. In some cases, as few as 1 in 5 people survived. And yet something about this culture permeated and survived the Middle Passage along with the people who went through it as well. Wekker notes that there were broad colonies of Mati or women-loving women, particularly in her ethnographic study of Mati culture in the colony of Suriname. There, women called each other patuari, or they wore the same clothes. They used romantic songs with each other called the Lobi song. One poem she notes read, "The rose is weak, it has fallen down. The rose is weak, it has fallen down, but steadfast, it stays upright." For centuries before contemporary culture emerged, African slaves and their descendants were forbidden from learning to read or write or marry without the consent of their oppressors, for their bodies, children, and families were the property of Europeans. Yet their culture survived. Resistance to oppression took many forms, such as dance or the creation of hybrid religions, were called syncretistic religions like voodoo, and the presentation and preservation of their social values, and particularly their social structure and categories. In short, one could own the bodies, but not the soul or heart or mind of enslaved peoples. Enslaved people retained their social structure, and therefore women-loving women who survived the Middle Passage did not necessarily become as denigrated as their European counterparts did in the American colonies, for instance. Yet the double effect of control was also ignorance. Europeans, like many imperialists, cared that the body made money and practiced an ethos that upheld the power of the state, ergo Christianity in this case. Social beliefs were obscure, just as well as the relationships of women-loving women did not intersect with the power holders. And so they were doubly obscure to the European oppressors. Women who loved other women were of little concern to patriarchy when they did not intersect with the means of production for the patriarchy in the form of marriage or children. Matism was thus doubly obscure to patriarchy. Black women in Suriname, or people of African descent in Suriname, today have an extensive Mati culture. In fact, Black people outnumbered white people, Europeans, for most of the colonial period, anywhere from 9 out of 10 people in the colonies to 3 out of 4. There were anti-miscegenation laws in areas like this going back as far as the 1600s. However, in North America, this was the only colonial system where Blacks didn't oftentimes outnumber whites. Therefore, the laws were harsher. The only colony in the North American colonies that actually had such a case of Blacks outnumbering whites or people of African descent outnumbering those of European was South Carolina. Early prescriptive laws, such as the anti-miscegenation laws in Maryland in 1643, prevented Black people from intermarrying with white people, learning to read, write, or own property. Wekker contends that the British colonial systems created a much harsher form of prescription for women-loving women in queer communities than they did in the French, Dutch, or Spanish colonies, even though those systems of oppression and slavery oftentimes had more people who died and were killed during the Middle Passage. Yet in contrast to the British system, the emphasis in the Dutch and French system was not on the creation of families for the commodification of the body or the production of wealth through enslaved peoples, but on the production of the extraction of mineral wealth and colonial wealth through the production of materials. So in essence, you have a dual system. The British system was harsher and more heterosexist, and the French, Dutch, and other European systems, the ethos was much more emphasized on work. African populations remained high for most of the course of this of these 3 or 4 centuries. And yet, as just as queer colonies in West Africa formed along the coast, you also had large and sustainable populations of queer people throughout the Caribbean and North and South America. In a contrast to the British colonies and later the American system, queer Black communities likely formed and even thrived under the plantation system, but were politically and socially less restricted than they were in their American and British counterparts. So in a sense, the Mati cultures of South America, which are vast and thriving today, and of the Caribbean, created a space where queerness was not only accepted, but became integrated into the system, and particularly because it didn't face the same level of scrutiny and wasn't in a system which had such an emphasis on the production of families. While we realized that the Middle Passage was dehumanizing, it was particularly brutal for Black women. Black women were allowed to roam freely on ships because they were viewed as objects of sexual desire, rape, and release for sailors. Black men were chained below, but Black women could oftentimes roam the ships freely because they weren't viewed as such a threat. And yet, in such cases where there were uprisings on Black ships, Black women were oftentimes blamed for the uprisings because they had the freedom of movement. And in many cases, they were also responsible for the instigation of rebellions on these slave ships. It became so of such interest to the British colonial system that Black women had to be escorted onto British ships in the mid-Atlantic in the 18th and 19th centuries before the end of the slave trade with an armed guard. During the Middle Passage, women also formed these intense social bonds called Matism, right? We can only speculate, but it's well reported that Black women were oftentimes raped. They were made to perform for the amusement of these sailors, and Black women were denigrated. But the form of these Mati same-sex relationships shored up companionship, created moral support, and helped to create a sense of bonding which transcended the Middle Passage. In effect, women loving women created a safe space, as it has throughout Western history, for women who are often subject to the prescriptions of patriarchy and the objectification of men. It created a sphere where men did not have control, and one of the few places during the Middle Passage that African women could find solace without the intervention of their oppressors. And while suicide was common on slave ships, women-loving women oftentimes kept their relationships secret, such that by the time they reached the New World, they would create songs memorializing their passage, which became the basis of the love songs in Suriname. They would lament the passage. They would start referring to each other as mi skin, mi kompe, matahe, my shipmate, or more specifically as Professor Natasha Tinsley, Omiseki Natasha Tinsley notes that after the Middle Passage, women started referring to each other as the savior of my body. Professor Tinsley notes that the birth of in the book, The Birth of Afro-American Culture, it said that Matism was prevalent in every African descendant culture of the Caribbean and South America, which lends us to speculation that such cultures were present in the American and British colonies, and long before the American and British colonies took over the French and Spanish colonies in Louisiana, Florida, and the Carolinas in the 18th and 19th centuries. Regardless, in maroon oral histories of Jamaica in the 17th century, they note Matism. They note that there were women-loving women as far back and as early as the 1650s. Specifically, that doctors in Jamaica noted that these Mati women had same-sex relationships with each other, and that they became a kind of fascination in Jamaica. Doctors in the early 20th century started to note this culture of Matism in the colony of Suriname right around 1912, specifically when the oil and rubber boom happened in the Amazon, causing a massive exodus of men in the colony, heightening the presence of women-loving women. One doctor noted that Paramaribo, the capital of Suriname, had become a, quote, city of women, and that women had come to dominate the trades, very similar to what happened in the United States in World War II. Tinsley also notes that the work ethic, as well as the imagery of the poetry of these women in the late 19th and early 20th century, had descended from the Middle Passage, meaning that the colonial garden became a lamentation for what they had had in West Africa, but also something that these women sought to create and offer to their shipmates in their community and their lovers and their friends afterwards. It became so central that the garden and the working class woman became central to the poetry of women loving women in the Caribbean, not simply in Suriname, but also in Haiti and in other African descendant cultures like the Barbados and Jamaica. So much so that the garden and the working class woman became synonymous, according to Tinsley, with a story of women loving women and a cultural signifier one can look for when looking for cultures of Black women loving women, particularly in those periods of time. Wekker critiques contemporary Black notions of Black lesbianism with Mati culture, noting that while Black lesbianism draws more on Western culture, Matism draws so much more on descendant African cultures. The historical categorical comparisons between Mati culture and queer communities of the United States is difficult, much less because the visibility of these women loving women is less visible, but it lends speculation, according to Wekker and to Tinsley, that there were similar Mati cultures or women loving women in the Spanish and French colonies of Florida, Louisiana, and the Carolinas specifically. There are likely stories for further exploration, such as if we're going to look for women loving women in the colonial history of Louisiana, one could look to the brothels or to the churches or to any form of gender signifying or gender nonconforming woman presenting in any of these different cultures. And likely this person is going to be attached to the cultures of the Mati culture descendant from Africa. But it represents a concrete historical, categorical, and framework and analysis to look for the lives of these women in Suriname and in Cuba and in Jamaica and in the Caribbean and see how they loved each other and see what culture this exemplifies. Most importantly, this offers a basis for looking at the cultures within the United States in the early pre-colonial, pre-revolutionary period. To close this quick lecture, women loving women must no longer be considered a category constructed from the point of view of Europeans. To quote the poem, love is a rose that stands upright. Love is a rose that is weak. Love is a rose that has fallen down, but when steadfast stays upright. And so that's all I have for today.
Wow, thank you. That's a lot. So what when you were going through all this and you were sort of pulling all the research and the threads together, what are a few things that really stood out for you as recurring in all of this?
Specifically, the ways that African descendant cultures maintained their cultural traditions even through the horror of the Middle Passage and the dehumanization of seasoning. That we've covered in the past, that and we'll cover next time, that there are very clear historical queer representations in all aspects of African descendant and African diaspora cultures, is a testament to the lives of queer people through that journey. It also says to me that while you had prescriptive heterosexist emphasis in British culture and later American cultures, which emphasized the production of wealth through the body, right? So in the South, the one thing that's kind of unique to American systems of slavery is that slaves could not buy their own freedom, right? And so that the perpetuation of the system became perpetualized along the colonization of the body, meaning that people could never own their body. Their body had to be owned by white people. And then you also had the perpetuation of that all the way to today. So what stood out to me the most is the connection and the liberation through the connection of the historical category of queer bodies of color. If we can restore the idea that there are queer people in the African diaspora, we look at systems of resistance to oppression, which is that queerness and cultural categories of queerness in all colonized peoples are forms of resistance, just in the fact that they exist to systems which seek to dehumanize, own, and completely dominate them. So
Yeah,
that's, I think, what got to me the most.
yeah, and it sounds a lot of this was preserved through these cultures of queer women, women who loved women, uh, and a lot of that was key to maintaining some of the traditions through that Middle Passage and into sort of the colonial slave system today. It's and when you commented about how the British system was really geared towards this idea of owning of the wealth coming from the reproduction of slaves, right? This really hits really strongly on something that I was running into with Sylvia Federici, who was talking about how the regulation of, and I'm going to use the words of another person, not Sylvia's, but another person who sort of turned me on to this, Rain Crow, uh, the use of or the regulation of feminized bodies, right? So people that today we would assign female at birth, people back then who would have been sort of expected to fulfill feminized roles, right? So the same sort of regulation of their bodies for the sake of reproductive labor. So reproducing more bodies to do more work, right? So their bodies had to be regulated, their sex had to be regulated, sex between individuals had to be regulated. What is permissible sex, right? And what is permissible labor based on what bodies do within reproducing more laborers, right? So there's there's a similar tie-in that I feel is going on there.
Yeah, there's actually a very famous article done by the very first generation of queer historians in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. I believe it's called Capitalism and uh, the Gay Body, or the something like that. But the central idea is that the body becomes a unit of production under a capitalistic system, and American capitalism and Western capitalism has its roots in the trade of slaves, gold, and black bodies, right? So the very roots of modern capitalism come from the oppression of black people and people of African descent and people of brown and indigenous peoples, right? That is the root of colonialism and the root of American and the root of all Western capitalism. But the idea is then that the particularly in the 19th century, families become units of production. So capitalist thinking becomes so extreme and so ingrained in the ethos of Western culture that the idea of people producing and workers producing bodies to serve the wealth making machine um, isn't necessarily new to that period of time, but does go all the way back to the ownership of white European descendants and white business owners and aristocratic white people and states uh, to black bodies and black children. It is the system of bondage created particularly in the British and American systems was so horrific that um, it's deeply tied to the complete dominance of white people over the bodies of black people, right? And that in essence becomes this great historical cultural ideology about how whiteness is constructed. But the economic unit of maintaining wealth through the ownership of black women and their children, right, becomes the essence of the American slave trade, right? And the essence of the power of King Cotton in the 19th century and the basis of the Southern Confederacy and even the basis of American capitalism itself. So I don't know if that answers your question, but the comment is true that that I think that the roots of capitalism, racism, and exploitation of feminized bodies is tied to the same thing, which is the dominance of the state over the production of the people, and more so as time goes on. And it's a very chilling lesson, particularly as we go through, as capitalism becomes more extreme in this day and age.
Yeah, definitely. And it definitely makes one rethink the concept of uh, sort of the ideals around what the ideal family is supposed to be as almost a reproductive unit, right? And whose labor are we wanting to reproduce, and whose labor society is wanting to regulate. So, and as we go into the 21st century, how does that manifest in in the future? Yeah.
Well, remember always that there's a system of production, right? It's all about the money, right? The ethos that supports that is oftentimes the religion of the state. There's a famous historian, I can't remember his name, who says that the preacher is but a mouthpiece for the king, right? And so the ideology becomes a self-justifying, self-propagating force alongside the system, right? The system upholds the ideology and vice versa. So my takeaway from this, though, is that those are not absolutes, right? There are forms of resistance. Being who you are, your authentic self, knowing the stories of your ancestors, knowing that there are whole cultures today that exist and survived those systems of colonial oppression and continue to thrive is testament to the tradition itself, right? So knowing that there are queer people represented in the religious synchronistic traditions of voodoo and others is testament to the fact that they outlasted the system that oppressed them, right? And the fact that queer histories of the Caribbean and of the African diaspora reveal roots that have not really been talked about in American history, to my knowledge, are stunning, right? Those are things that are out there that every queer Black person can go see and find for themselves and be connected to. I think the greatest testament to this is that the systems which survive, the beliefs, the cultures are still around today, right? Capitalism's not going away, it's still around. But so are the names and the stories of these folks. And in many cases, they're thriving.
And that is good. That leaves us on a very hopeful note. And we've got a couple of books that David recommends on this topic, which we'll include in the bibliography. Did you want to say anything about either of these two, real quick, David?
I will say this: the stories by you'll want to look at Gloria Wekker in the Greatest Taboo. She's I forget which chapter, but it's an excellent short article. She's trained as an anthropologist, but looks at the history of Matism in Africa and looks at the categories of how one can trace women loving women through the African diaspora. In Thieving Sugar, Professor Tinsley looks at the poetry and traces the history a little more fully, but particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, and both are excellent books. What you see is the continuation of culture in both places, and I think these are good beginning points for understanding how the histories of Black women loving women or African descendant women loving women are existent today and can be the bridge in the culture can be created from the earliest points of American history to these neighboring contemporary African descendant cultures.
Awesome. And what do you have coming up for us next time, David?
Our next lecture is going to look at the history of queer African descendant cultures in the Caribbean, looking at specifically looking later at I'm sorry, our next lecture is actually looking at Adula Equiano, who was probably a gay man who lived in the British colonial system. And then we're going to be looking at the African descendant cultures in the Caribbean. And then we're going to be wrapping up with some more contemporary American stories.
Great. Looking forward to it. Thank you,
Wonderful.
David.
Thank
So
you.
remember to like and subscribe and hit uh, reminder the reminders bell to catch more of this, and uh, let us know what these bring up for you or your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you.